20th of October 1944. Red Beach, Leyte Gulf. Humid air pressed low over a sodden jungle line as gray dawn lifted and the surf thudded with the slow regularity of breath. From shallow foxholes beneath a dripping canopy, infantrymen of the 23rd Infantry Regiment of the Imperial Japanese Army watched breakers boil with American landing craft and braced for the close. Murderous work they knew: mines, tripwires, snipers. The short blast of a grenade in the green. Instead, over the hiss of rain and the insect buzz came a new sound, deep, metallic, and patient, like a millstone grinding the island itself. A hulking crawler bulldozer nosed out of the shallows, exhaust coughing in the wet, its steel blade squared against the jungle. Mud clung to its cleats. Vines snapped across its bonnet. The machine, about 13 tons of riveted mass and an engine near 80 horsepower, lurched forward at a walking pace, and trees that had stood for decades leaned, shuddered, and went down with a ripping crack that silenced the birds. They had not trained for this. In minutes, engineers in hasty khaki and helmet nets marched behind the blade, flags up, hands chopping directions, and another dozer followed, and then another. The swath widened, 8, then 12 feet across, roots torn, spider-webbed trench covers heaved aside like mats. Foxholes that had been invisible at 2 meters opened like mouths. Firing slits collapsed into clods and water. A mortar pit carefully camouflaged with palm fronds turned to slurry as the blade rode over it, and the men inside scrambled choking in the vapor of wet earth and gasoline. What looked slow at a distance was relentless up close. Where the 23rd had counted on thickets to break formations into targets for bayonet and grenade, the Americans laid highways for infantry, then sledded 105mm pieces into new fields of fire and dragged communications wire across ground that no patrol had passed the day before. Shock arrived, not with shrapnel, but with the sudden visibility of everything that was supposed to be hidden. One soldier would later remember the smell most: sap and diesel, because that was the moment hope thinned. If the jungle could fall this fast, the defenses built beneath it were already obsolete. The morning on Leyte became a lesson written in mud and splinters. And from this moment, we follow how such machines and the engineers who drove them turned Earth itself into a weapon, and how that idea spread across the Pacific. In the first years of the Pacific War, the Imperial Japanese Army advanced with confidence into landscapes it believed would neutralize the industrial strengths of its enemies. Dense rainforests, knife-edged ridges, and trackless swamps from the Malayan Peninsula to Guadalcanal were treated as natural fortresses, perfectly suited to Japanese doctrine. Their infantry was trained to move silently through vines and bamboo, to strike at night, to cut units into isolated pockets, and to let disease and exhaustion finish the job. Officers drilled their men to think of the jungle as a weapon, one that favored stealth over steel and discipline over machines. Tanks were rare, trucks struggled on muddy tracks, and heavy equipment was often left behind, not only because shipping space was scarce, but because commanders believed such tools were unnecessary and even burdensome in terrain that seemed to reject wheels and engines. The Allies entered these arenas with a steep learning curve. Early campaigns revealed that simply having superior firepower did not guarantee momentum. On Guadalcanal, infantry pushed painfully through thickets where a single mile could take hours. On New Guinea, supply lines evaporated into swamps, and artillery positions lacked clear fields of fire. Even when victories came, they came slowly, and at the cost of men lost not just to bullets but to heat, rain, and malarial mosquitoes. The jungle, dark, wet, and nearly impenetrable, served as a silent ally to the Japanese defensive line. By late 1944, however, experience had reshaped Allied thinking. Under General Douglas MacArthur's command in the Southwest Pacific area, engineers moved from rear support into the vanguard. Bulldozers, graders, and other earth-moving giants were no longer reserved for airfields safely behind the fighting. Instead, they became tools of assault, carving roads through forests so tanks and supply trucks could follow, and stripping away the camouflage that gave the defender strength. The Japanese reliance on natural terrain had been logical until the terrain itself could be overturned. In the following section, we turn to the technology that allowed these machines to conquer nature and undermine an entire doctrine of war almost overnight. Heavy construction machinery, machines usually reserved for ports, depots, and airstrips, became instruments of direct combat once the Allies realized that the jungle itself was the enemy's greatest fortification. At the center of this transformation stood the crawler bulldozer, low-slung and unstoppable, running on wide steel tracks that gripped mud and root alike. Weighing between 10 and 15 tons depending on the model, these dozers carried front blades broad enough to bite through 2 to 3 meters of vegetation with every push. Their engines, often in the 80 to 100 horsepower range, were simple, rugged, and relatively easy to repair in the field. A single trained operator could bring down trees up to 40 feet high in seconds, break through tangled vines that would halt infantry for hours, and carve fresh roads at rates unimaginable only a year earlier. Supporting machines extended that power. Road graders followed behind, shaving newly opened paths smooth enough for trucks and tanks. Specialized trench dozers could scoop out anti-tank ditches or bury enemy positions beneath tons of earth. Maintenance teams kept these machines running even under fire, swapping tracks and fuels with practiced speed. And engineers were not passive laborers. They carried rifles and carbines, ready to fight if the blade drew too close to a concealed bunker. The U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers formed the backbone of this new mechanized assault concept. Photographs from 1944 and 1945 show Seabee operators pushing through palm groves in the Philippines, their machines draped in cut fronds for camouflage as they advanced within range of Japanese riflemen. The crucial evolution was not the machinery itself. These bulldozers had existed before the war, but where and how they were used. No longer confined to the rear, they rolled into contested zones, shaping terrain faster than defenders could adapt. The result was a sudden surge of momentum, stripping the jungle of its secrecy and turning nature's fortress into exposed ground. In the next section, we move from engineering theory to the first battlefield where this mechanized force reshaped the fight and sent ripples of fear through Japanese defenses. The first major test of bulldozers as front line. Assault tools came with the Battle of Leyte, launched on 20th October 1944. When Allied forces surged ashore along the eastern beaches of the Philippine island under a sky streaked with smoke and monsoon cloud. As infantry of the U.S. 6th Army pressed into the thickets inland, engineer detachments arrived almost alongside them, disembarking with bulldozers still slick from the sea. Their orders were immediate: carve supply routes through the dense coastal vegetation before Japanese defenses could solidify. Trees that scouts had marked as formidable obstacles fell one after another as steel blades chewed forward. Each fresh gap allowed jeeps and ammunition trucks to roll where the day before only vines and mangrove roots twisted through the mud. In the interior ridges, the Imperial Japanese Army's 16th Infantry Regiment, veterans of earlier campaigns, had shaped its defenses around the assumption that heavy machinery could not reach them. They built trenches beneath the canopy, sighted machine guns in ravines, and counted on narrow, slick footpaths to slow any mechanized force to a crawl. But within hours of the landings, the deep growl of engines echoed up the hillsides. Bulldozers emerged through foliage like armored animals, collapsing parapets, widening narrow tracks into motorable roads, and leveling the carefully preserved natural screens that had masked Japanese positions. A diary fragment later attributed to a Japanese private described the metal monster that swallowed the jungle whole, a phrase that captured both the noise and the sense of inevitability as concealment disappeared. With these new corridors open, field artillery could be hauled forward the same day, and medium tanks clanked up slopes once written off as impassable. The rapid breach of the defensive belt on Leyte's central spine showed that terrain no longer guaranteed safety. This early success ensured bulldozers would accompany future assaults, forcing Japanese planners to confront a threat that altered both tactics and morale. Next, we examine how Japanese intelligence tried to make sense of this unexpected enemy capability. News of the devastation on Leyte traveled quickly through Japanese channels. first as scattered field notes and then as formal alarm. By late November 1944, headquarters officers trying to interpret the sudden loss of defensive positions received increasingly urgent accounts from surviving platoon leaders. They described Allied engineers driving machines straight into foliage that should have stopped any vehicle, the sound of engines reverberating through ravines, and entire trenches collapsing as roots were torn from the earth. In the early winter of that year, with Leyte still fiercely contested, intelligence officers at Imperial General Headquarters compiled a preliminary summary. It cautioned that the Americans were now employing road machines where previously we assumed only handwork was possible, a bureaucratic phrasing that scarcely captured the shock felt by frontline troops, the foundation of Japan's jungle. Doctrine, sanctuary, and terrain seemed suddenly uncertain. High Command had long believed that minimal mechanization was not a weakness, but a natural advantage in tropical environments. Now, however, what they had counted on as a barrier had become a liability. Field commanders struggled to adapt on the fly. Some ordered deeper excavation of positions, convinced that thicker soil layers might resist bulldozer blades. Others shifted companies to steeper slopes and ridges, hoping angles alone would deter the machines. But Japan's logistical limitations were stark. The Army lacked specialized counter-engineering tools, could not replace destroyed fieldworks quickly, and remained dependent on manual labor against opponents equipped to overturn nature with fuel and steel. The psychological blow ran deeper than tactical confusion. Soldiers who had trained for silent stalks through the underbrush now faced a threat that announced itself with deafening certainty. A sergeant later wrote that they had prepared to ambush men, not to confront metal monsters that carved open our lines. That phrase encapsulated a growing dread. No hiding place was truly hidden anymore. Recognizing this vulnerability, Allied planners expanded their engineer-led tactics, confident that production and logistics could sustain the massed deployment of these machines, a shift we now explore as the key to scaling this strategy across the Pacific. The sudden appearance of bulldozers in frontline jungles was not a coincidence, but the result of a massive industrial and logistical effort unfolding thousands of miles from the fighting. American factories poured out tractors, graders, and dozers in quantities inconceivable to their adversaries. Machines originally designed for farms, highways, and construction sites were redirected toward a new kind of warfare. Shipping manifests from 1944 show entire convoys carrying crated bulldozers to the Southwest Pacific, where they were assigned to engineer formations prepared to use them not months later in rear-base construction, but within hours of landings. Under the direction of engineering leaders such as Brigadier General Hugh J. Casey, the U.S. Army Service Command, ASCOM, organized more than 20,000 personnel into a force whose purpose was to build and maintain the arteries of invasion. They trained to offload heavy equipment directly onto open beaches, improvising ramps and pontoons so that dozers could splash through surf and climb onto newly won ground before defenders could recover. Once ashore, the challenge shifted to keeping those engines alive in climates that rusted metal overnight and turned trails into pits of sucking clay. Monsoon rains soaked wiring, tropical humidity chewed through bearings, mud-choked radiators. In response, the Seabees and Army engineers built mobile maintenance teams that followed the machines as closely as medics followed infantry. Spare parts arrived in prefabricated kits. Tracks were swapped under fire. Temporary workshops sprouted from tents and salvaged timber. Every hour a bulldozer was down could delay an infantry battalion's advance, so speed became doctrine. This logistical advantage translated directly into battlefield momentum. If engineers could slice 100 to 200 meters of road through thick vegetation every hour, artillery and supply columns could keep pace, denying the Japanese defenders the time they needed to reorganize. And because American production could replace losses, the tactic was repeatable. One island to the next, the machines arrived in numbers that seemed inexhaustible. Industrial power and logistical planning had turned a civilian tool into a weapon of acceleration. In the next section, we see how this rapidly maturing doctrine proved itself again on new fronts. reinforcing the lesson that the jungle would no longer decide the shape of war. By the opening months of 1945, bulldozers at the front were no longer an experiment. They were a standard expectation wherever Allied forces pushed against Japanese positions in the Philippines and Borneo. Operations east of Manila at the Battle of Wawa Dam between February and May 1945 illustrated the growing sophistication of this tactic. The Japanese had fortified the steep terrain around Woodpecker Ridge, convinced that the rugged hillsides and narrow approaches would prevent armor from threatening their bunkers. Yet engineer units carved new roads across the ridgeline itself, hewing through brush and volcanic soil while still under fire. Within days, medium tanks and specialized flamethrower tanks crawled along freshly cut paths, bringing weapons into spaces once reachable only by hand-carried rifles. The Kobayashi force tasked with holding those heights found not only their concealment gone, but their defensive geometry upended. Armor now loomed where only shadows had existed before. The lesson repeated itself on Borneo. In the Battle of Tarakan from 1st May to 21st June 1945, the Japanese relied heavily on swamp, mangrove, and thick coastal jungle to guard approaches to their airfield. They expected infantry-only advances, slow and attritional. Instead, engineers rapidly cleared broad corridors through the marshy growth, draining ground and laying timber surfacing so vehicles could move. What had been viewed as secure, bogged-down rear positions suddenly lay within artillery range. The airfield, critical to Japanese defensive plans, was isolated far faster than anticipated. Each success reinforced an emerging truth. The jungle could be conquered not by inching through it, but by reshaping it. When bulldozers toppled the canopy and carved open hillsides, depth ceased to equal safety. Japanese officers increasingly recognized that their strongest natural ally was slipping away, and that the engineers who drove those machines were as decisive as any tank crew or battalion commander. This shift did more than break fortifications, it broke confidence. Next, we examine how the psychological shock of seeing the jungle destroyed eroded Japanese morale and altered their willingness to stand in ground they had once believed untouchable. For Japanese infantry conditioned to believe, that thick vegetation was their shield. The first appearance of bulldozers ripping open the jungle produced something deeper than tactical surprise. It struck at the foundation of their confidence. A position dug beneath tangled vines and towering palms, once judged secure for days or weeks, could now be exposed in a single morning. Hidden machine gun nests suddenly lay within direct line of sight of enemy tanks. Mortar pits carefully camouflaged with fern mats became bright scars of earth once a steel blade pushed through. In after-action reflections, some survivors described the shock as a kind of betrayal by the land itself. The jungle, long considered an indispensable ally, had been turned hostile, its collapse a distinct psychological rupture. This shift also changed how fear manifested. Instead of nerves tightening in the quiet hours before an expected assault, dread grew louder in the constant roar of engines. The sound of a bulldozer's gearbox grinding forward meant concealment was seconds from vanishing. Reports collected by Japanese officers used language that edged toward the mythic metal. Beasts, or a monster that ate the forest. Soldiers, who had trained to outwit men, were now asked to stand firm as nature was peeled away above their heads. Some units yielded ground earlier than doctrine allowed, and junior leaders struggled to maintain discipline when defensive plans disintegrated faster than they could adapt. On the Allied side, meanwhile, morale accelerated. Engineers, often uncelebrated compared to infantry, found themselves at the spear point of advances, clearing routes that let the battle flow instead of bog down. Army and Marine units saw progress where before there had been only sweat and slow attrition. The speed of breakthroughs on Leyte confirmed that bulldozer-cleared paths could collapse resistance not only physically, but mentally, as the symbolism of a torn canopy reinforced the impression that the Japanese no longer controlled the environment. When terrain ceased to offer the defender certainty, decisions on where to stand and when to fight grew clouded. That uncertainty translated into faster withdrawals, shattered command cohesion, and declining willingness to counterattack. with morale shaken and defensive assumptions overturned. The battlefield itself changed shape, and the tactical consequences of that transformation now come sharply into focus. The arrival of heavy engineer equipment at the front reshaped the tactical grammar of jungle warfare. For years, Japanese commanders had depended on the environment to slow attacks and force head-on engagements through narrow choke points. But when bulldozers began carving new approaches across Leyte and Luzon, the Allies broke free from those constraints. Movement, once dictated by the jungle, shifted back into the attacker's hands. Obstacles that might have taken days of axe work or explosives to clear were swept aside in minutes. Lateral routes appeared where none had existed, allowing infantry to shift flanks without plunging into dense undergrowth and giving artillery batteries the ability to relocate rapidly to exploit breakthroughs. Medium tanks, previously relegated to beaches and open paddies, now rolled up slopes and through groves thought impassable, multiplying the firepower at the decisive points of each fight. This new mobility delivered strategic consequences. Defenses built around static jungle lines lost their staying power once the Americans could simply cut around them. Commanders on Leyte saw Japanese reserves committed prematurely, thrown into battle before coordinated counterattacks could form. On Luzon's southern approaches and around the Wawa Dam complex, the same dynamic unfolded. The enemy's carefully prepared redoubts, anchored to ridge spines and ravines, were threatened from directions once considered immune to mechanized assault. As supporting arms surged forward, Japanese units found their depth stripped away, their fallback positions rendered irrelevant almost as soon as they were occupied. The broader pattern became unmistakable. The collapse of Japanese defenses in the Philippines during 1945 was not driven solely by numbers or attrition, but by the erosion of terrain-based security. Engineers unlocked the jungle, and with it the ability to attack the interior of every island stronghold faster than Japanese doctrine could comprehend. Yet no tactic remains unchallenged forever. The enemy would adapt, changing how they built, fought, and hid in a world where the jungle no longer guaranteed protection. In the next section, we examine those reactions and the limits exposed in this new approach. Success did not come without friction. Even as bulldozers reshaped the Pacific battlefield, their limitations became apparent in the most punishing environments. On steep volcanic slopes, like those rising toward the Sierra Madre or in the jagged interiors of Borneo, steel tracks lost purchase, engines strained against gravity, and progress slowed to a crawl. Coral ridges and rock shelves dulled blades or shattered teeth, requiring replacements that might be days away across the ocean supply chain. In monsoon conditions, a single night of rain could turn a newly cut track into a river of mud, choking radiators and bogging down machines until recovery crews could drag them free. Every advance required a continuous flow of fuel, spare parts, and trained mechanics. Without those lifelines, the dozer became little more than immobile scrap under the canopy. The Japanese, quick to observe Allied patterns, adapted where they could. Mines and improvised explosive devices appeared along fresh cuts through felled timber. Booby traps targeted not infantry squads, but the very machines that led the advance. Some commanders abandoned forward zones entirely, drawing defenders into ravines so narrow or slopes so sharp that only lightly equipped infantry could give chase. Others shifted deeper into the jungle's untouched mass, seeking ground where the metal behemoths could not follow. And whenever engineer detachments pushed too far without direct support, Japanese raiders attempted ambushes from the flanks. Knowing that the destruction of even a few bulldozers could stall an entire brigade's advance, Allied planners responded in kind. By mid-1945, more sophisticated reconnaissance of soil and vegetation informed where machines would be committed. Forward repair teams and parts depots reduced downtime. Infantry screens and armor escorts kept dozer crews alive while they worked. Artillery and air support blasted difficult choke points before the engineers moved in. What began as a daring innovation matured into a reliable doctrine. The engineer-infantry partnership, using steel to master terrain as decisively as firepower mastered combat. These wartime adjustments set the stage for a transformation that extended long after the Pacific battles ended. influencing how future armies would view terrain, not as destiny, but as material to be shaped. The sudden use of bulldozers in the Pacific did more than win battles. It altered expectations about what war could look like when engineers shaped terrain as aggressively as infantry fought upon it. In the early 1940s, no Japanese planner had imagined that dense tropical growth could be torn aside in hours, or that ridgelines, once immune to wheels and tracks, could become avenues of attack. Yet by 1945, the Allies had proved that earth-moving machines could be deployed as decisively as any armored column. That revelation lingered long after the guns fell silent. Doctrine and training manuals absorbed the lesson that mobility need not be granted by geography. It could be created by force. The very idea that nature could be engineered into compliance, and that denying an enemy terrain was as important as denying them ammunition, became a structural part of military thinking. Engineer units, once relegated to building depots and patching roads, emerged from the war recognized as combat arms in their own right. Their ability to alter battlefields, cutting fire lanes, forcing access to interior strongholds, and exposing defenses that relied on concealment, formed a new pillar of operational planning. Commanders now expected engineers to accompany early assault waves, clearing and constructing at the same pace as riflemen advanced. The psychological lesson also endured. Surprises in mobility could cause defenses to unravel faster than any direct assault. If a defender believed a position unassailable, the shock of seeing it breached by machines could fracture morale before the first artillery round landed. Looking back from the final stages of the Pacific War to that first moment on Leyte, the legacy becomes clear. The bewilderment of Japanese infantry who watched their jungle fortress fall to steel blades foreshadowed a broader shift in warfare, one where logistics, engineering, and imagination redefined what even the thickest vegetation could protect. As we return to the Philippine jungle of late 1944, we recognize that the earth itself had become part of the contest, and those who could master it would master the war. October 1944, Leyte's humid dawn returns to mind. Beneath that thick canopy, Japanese infantry crouched in shadow, confident that the jungle would hide them and slow the invader. Then came the engine's low growl, steady and unbothered by vines or mud. A bulldozer lurched into view, its steel blade biting deep, roots snapping, trees falling in cascades of leaves and splinters. In minutes, ground that had been a natural maze became a raw, open path. The defenders, trained to fight in silence and surprise, watched their carefully prepared world vanish under the indifferent push of a machine. That moment stands as a symbol of reversal, of how assumptions in war can be broken as swiftly as wood under steel. Engineers, long considered behind-the-lines laborers, had turned their craft into a weapon. They changed not only the shape of the land, but the shape of the battle. Mobility surged where stagnation once ruled. Firepower reached where it had never been allowed. Morale faltered where confidence had stood. The jungle fortress, long trusted by the Imperial Japanese Army, proved fallible when confronted by the fusion of industrial might and tactical imagination. For the soldier hearing that first bulldozer's approach, the roar signaled not merely danger, but a new truth. The environment would no longer protect them. The Pacific War's outcome did not hinge on machines alone, but in those hours when the earth itself moved for the Allies, defeat seemed to rise from the soil. The unsung engines of progress had arrived, reshaping islands and expectations alike, and leaving behind a final lesson. Victory belongs to those who refuse to let terrain decide their fate.